He mocked the Massey Ferguson at the dealer lot. 3 years later, he was buying one. There are certain moments in a small farming county that everybody remembers the same way, even years later, even after the people involved have mostly made peace with what happened. The moment usually involves a dealer lot, a crowd of farmers who weren't trying to witness anything in particular, and one man saying something out loud that he probably should have kept to himself. This is one of those stories. It happened at Voss Equipment, a multi-brand dealership on the edge of a county that ran heavy to corn and soybeans, on a Saturday morning in late March, when half the operators in the area had nothing better to do than stand around the lot before planting season swallowed their schedules whole. The man at the center of it was Kurt Halloran, 46 years old at the time, running just over 1,000 acres that his father had built up from a much smaller base, and known throughout the county as a man who had strong opinions about almost everything and very little hesitation about sharing them. He wasn't disliked, exactly. People generally found him entertaining in the way a loud uncle is entertaining at a family gathering, funny, confident, occasionally exhausting, but not malicious. He'd run John Deere Green his entire farming life, the way his father had before him, and he treated that loyalty the way some men treat a hometown sports team, with a kind of reflexive pride that didn't require much justification because it had simply always been true. That Saturday, a neighbor of his named Pete Sorrell was at Voss looking at a Massey Ferguson 7726, a 230 horsepower machine that had just come in on the lot with a clean trade history and a price that Pete thought was fair. Pete wasn't flashy about equipment decisions. He ran a modest 1,500 acres, kept his machinery a reasonable number of years, and made decisions based on what the numbers told him, rather than what color looked best in his shed. He'd done his homework on the 7726, talked to 2 other operators in a neighboring county who ran the same model, checked service records, compared the spec sheet against what he actually needed for his ground. He was standing next to it that morning, running a hand along the hood, having what amounted to a quiet, serious conversation with himself about whether this was the right next step for his operation. Kurt walked up while Pete was mid-thought, the way Kurt tended to walk into most conversations, and within about 30 seconds had turned a private moment into a small audience event. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He genuinely believed what he was saying. But what he said, loud enough that 4 or 5 other farmers standing nearby couldn't help but hear it, was that buying a Massey Ferguson in this day and age was like buying a flip phone when everyone else had moved on. He said it with a grin, the kind of grin that's meant to invite other people to laugh along rather than take offense. And a couple of the bystanders did laugh, mostly out of social reflex rather than genuine agreement. Pete didn't say much back. He wasn't a confrontational man, and he'd known Kurt long enough to understand that arguing with him in front of an audience rarely accomplished anything except giving Kurt more material to work with. He finished his conversation with the salesman, took a brochure, and left without buying that day, though not because of anything Kurt had said. He told people later he simply wanted to sleep on the decision, which was his normal process for anything involving that kind of money. Kurt, for his part, treated the moment as a minor entertainment and didn't think much more about it that day. He went home, finished his preseason equipment checks on his own fleet, 2 John Deere tractors, a sprayer, and a combine that was getting up there in years but still ran adequately, and didn't mention the exchange again to anyone, because in his mind it hadn't really been an exchange. It had been a joke, and jokes, in his experience, didn't usually have consequences. He was wrong about that, though it would take 3 years for the wrongness to fully reveal itself. Pete Sorrell bought the 7726 the following week, after sleeping on it the way he'd planned to. He didn't make a show of the purchase. He drove it home on a Tuesday afternoon, parked it in his shed, and went back to the ordinary business of preparing for planting season. If he thought about what Kurt had said at the dealership, he didn't mention it to anyone. He simply went to work. The first season told very little, the way first seasons usually do. Pete ran the 7726 through planting, through a moderately difficult midsummer stretch with some dry weeks but nothing severe, and through harvest without any notable mechanical issues. His yields that year were solid, in line with his historical averages, neither remarkable nor disappointing. Kurt's operation had a comparable season on his own equipment, also solid, also unremarkable. Nobody in the county was paying particular attention to whose tractor was outperforming whose, because there wasn't yet a story to tell. Equipment performs or it doesn't, season by season, and most seasons simply don't generate the kind of contrast that makes for a memorable comparison. The contrast started building in year 2. Kurt's older combine, the one he'd been nursing along for several seasons longer than he probably should have, started showing its age in ways that were hard to ignore. A rotor-bearing failure in the middle of harvest cost him 4 days waiting on a part that had to be shipped from out of state, because the dealer's regional parts network didn't carry that particular component in stock anymore for a combine of that vintage. 4 days during harvest, in a year when the weather forecast was showing a wet stretch moving in from the west, is not a small inconvenience. It's the kind of delay that turns into real yield loss if the rain arrives before the crop comes off, because standing corn in wet conditions starts to lodge, starts to lose test weight, starts to create harvest problems that compound the longer the delay continues. The rain did arrive 2 days into the part's wait. Kurt got the combine running again on day 5, but by then he was racing wet ground and a crop that had already started to go down in a couple of his lower fields. He brought in roughly 6% less than he'd projected that year, a number that doesn't sound catastrophic in isolation, but that represented real money on a 1,000-acre operation. Money that came directly off his bottom line in a year when commodity prices weren't doing him any particular favors either. Pete's harvest that same fall went smoothly. He'd had no major mechanical issues across his fleet, including the Massey Ferguson, which had now logged a full 2 seasons of work without anything beyond routine maintenance. His yields were modestly up from the year before, partly weather, partly agronomic decisions, and partly, though he wouldn't have claimed this loudly himself, the simple fact that his equipment had let him execute every field operation on schedule, rather than around mechanical interruptions. Nobody made a big deal out of the comparison that year, at least not publicly. Farmers in that county generally understood that one rough harvest didn't define an operation, and Kurt's combine trouble was, on its face, just bad luck with an aging machine rather than evidence of anything larger. But there were a few quiet conversations at the co-op that winter, the kind that happen over coffee when men are comparing notes on how their year went, and Kurt's name came up in some of them in a way that wasn't unkind exactly, but wasn't entirely sympathetic either. A few people remembered the comment at Voss Equipment 2 years earlier. Small counties have long memories, especially when a confident remark turns out to be followed by an inconvenient season. Kurt felt the shift, even if nobody said anything to his face. He wasn't an oblivious man. He understood, in the way a person understands these things without anyone spelling it out, that his harvest trouble had become a small data point in an ongoing, informal scoreboard that the county kept on every operation without ever announcing the rules out loud. He responded the way a lot of proud men respond to an uncomfortable data point. He explained it away. The combine was old, he told people, and he'd been planning to replace it anyway. The parts delay was a fluke, an unusual gap in a dealer network that normally served him fine. None of it had anything to do with brand performance broadly, he said, just one specific machine reaching the end of its useful life at an inconvenient moment. There was truth in what he was saying. Equipment ages, parts networks have gaps. Bad timing happens to every operation, eventually regardless of what's painted on the hood. But the explanation, however reasonable, didn't fully account for what happened the following year, because the following year delivered a second data point that was much harder to wave away. Year 3 brought a genuinely difficult growing season to that county, a wet spring that delayed planning for nearly everyone, followed by a dry, hot July that put real stress on crops across the region, regardless of brand loyalty or equipment choice. It was the kind of season that, like the drought stories farmers tell from other hard years, tested every operation's equipment reliability simultaneously, and left very little room for anyone to hide behind luck or excuses. Kurt had replaced the old combine by then, trading up to a newer model from the same manufacturer, but he kept his primary field tractor, a machine that was now 5 years into a financing term and starting to show the kind of wear that comes from being run hard across 1,000 acres for half a decade. In the wet spring, trying to push a tillage pass before a forecasted rain system, that tractor developed a hydraulic leak severe enough that Kurt had to shut down midfield and call for a service truck. The technician who came out diagnosed a failed seal in a system that, as it turned out, had a documented pattern of similar failures on that particular model and engine hour range. A detail the technician mentioned almost in passing, but that stuck with Kurt for reasons he didn't examine too closely at the time. The repair took 6 days, counting the wait for the part and the labor once it arrived. 6 days in the middle of a compressed, weather-driven planting window is a serious problem, and Kurt ended up planting close to 2 weeks later than he wanted to on a significant portion of his acreage, a delay that the dry July that followed made considerably worse, because late-planted corn going into a hot, dry stretch tends to suffer more than corn that had time to establish a deeper root system before the stress arrived. Pete's operation, meanwhile, came through that same wet spring without a comparable interruption. The 7726 worked through the available windows efficiently, got his planning done within a few days of his target schedule despite the weather, and gave him no mechanical surprises through the stressful July that followed. His yields that fall, in a year that was difficult for nearly everyone in the county, held up better than most, and noticeably better than Kurt's. This time, the comparison wasn't a quiet undercurrent at the co-op. It became something people discussed more directly, not maliciously, but with the kind of frank acknowledgement that farmers extend to results they can plainly see. 2 difficult seasons out of 3, Kurt's equipment had failed him at the worst possible moment. 2 difficult seasons out of 3, Pete's hadn't. The math wasn't subtle, and in a county where everyone watches everyone else's operation, the way people in other professions might watch a colleague's career, the pattern had become impossible to wave away with talk of bad luck or aging equipment. Kurt didn't enjoy this period of his farming life, and he would say so himself, years later, with a level of candor that surprised some people who remembered the man from the Voss equipment lot. The repeated mechanical failures cost him real money, 2 seasons of yield loss that he calculated conservatively at something in the neighborhood of $80,000 combined, once he accounted for the lost bushels, the emergency repair costs, and the operating loan extension he'd had to negotiate to cover the gap. It also cost him something less measurable, but, in his own account, almost as significant: the quiet discomfort of knowing that a remark he'd made as a throwaway joke 3 years earlier had aged into something that looked, in retrospect, less like confidence, and more like a man who hadn't actually done his homework before mocking someone who had. He didn't decide to switch brands all at once. It happened the way most significant decisions happen for careful operators, which is gradually, through a long accumulation of small observations and conversations rather than a single dramatic moment of clarity. He talked to Pete directly that winter, for the first time in 3 years, having a real conversation about equipment rather than a joke at his expense. And Pete, who held no grudge about the original comment and had mostly forgotten about it himself until Kurt brought it up, walked him through his experience with the 7726, honestly, and without any particular agenda. He talked to 2 other operators in neighboring counties who ran Massey Ferguson equipment, asked them about service history, about dealer support, about the kinds of failure patterns Kurt had been dealing with on his own fleet. He pulled maintenance records, compared specifications, did the kind of careful, unglamorous research that he probably should have done before he ever opened his mouth at that dealership 3 years earlier. What he found across that research was not a story of one brand being categorically superior to another in every circumstance. Kurt was too experienced an operator by then to believe in that kind of simple narrative, and he said as much to anyone who asked him about his decision later. Every manufacturer has strong models and weak ones, good years and bad ones, and plenty of farmers run the brand Kurt had mocked and have nothing but trouble with it, just as plenty of farmers run his original brand and never have a serious issue. But what he found specifically in the models and configurations relevant to his own operation was a service and reliability pattern that lined up closely with what he'd actually experienced over those 3 difficult seasons, and a dealer support network in his immediate region that had a stronger track record of fast parts availability than the network he'd been relying on. He traded his primary tractor that following spring, drove to Voss Equipment, the same dealership, the same lot where he'd made the original comment, and ordered a Massey Ferguson 8700S, the same model line, as it happened, that another farmer in that same county had once bought after 11 months of sitting unsold during a drought that exposed exactly the kind of reliability gap Kurt was now trying to solve for in his own operation. The salesman who helped him, a younger man who hadn't been working there during the original incident, had no idea about the history behind the purchase. Kurt didn't explain it to him. But word moved through the county the way it always does, and within a week, most of the people who'd been standing in that lot 3 years earlier when Kurt made his original remark had heard, one way or another, that he'd quietly ordered the exact kind of machine he'd once compared to an obsolete flip phone. Pete found out from a mutual friend, rather than from Kurt directly, and his reaction, when people asked him about it later, was notably free of triumph. He said he didn't feel vindicated exactly, because he hadn't bought his own tractor to prove anything to anyone in the first place. He'd bought it because the numbers made sense for his operation, and the fact that it had performed well over 3 years was simply the equipment doing what good equipment is supposed to do, not a personal victory over a neighbor who'd made an offhand joke at a dealership. Kurt, for his part, didn't try to hide from the history once the new tractor was sitting in his shed. When people brought it up, sometimes gently, sometimes with the kind of needling humor that farmers extend to each other in situations exactly like this one, he didn't get defensive. He'd usually just say something to the effect that he'd been wrong, that the joke he made 3 years earlier had been the kind of thing a man says when he hasn't actually looked closely enough at what he's talking about, and that 2 hard seasons had taught him more about equipment evaluation than 2 decades of casual brand loyalty ever had. He ran that 8700S for the following several seasons without the kind of mechanical interruptions that had defined his prior 3 years. It wasn't a perfect machine, no machine is, but it gave him the kind of dependable, unremarkable performance that doesn't generate stories, which after the previous several years was exactly what he wanted from a piece of equipment. Boring, in farming, is usually a compliment, and Kurt had come to understand that the hard way. The story circulated around that county for years afterward, the way good stories do, told slightly differently depending on who was telling it and which detail they wanted to emphasize. Some versions focused on the comeuppance of it, the satisfying arc of a loud man eating his own words. Other versions, usually told by people who liked Kurt and didn't want to make him out to be a fool, focused instead on the harder, more honest part of the story. That it takes a particular kind of maturity to publicly mock a decision, and then 3 years later, walk back into the same dealership and admit, through the simple act of a purchase, that the decision had been right all along. Kurt himself eventually settled into telling the story a certain way when it came up, usually at the co-op, usually with a kind of self-aware humor that suggested he'd made peace with how it had unfolded. He'd say that the joke he made at Pete's expense that Saturday morning had cost him nothing in the moment, and a great deal 3 years later, and that the real lesson wasn't about which brand of tractor was better in some abstract sense. The lesson was that equipment decisions, like most serious decisions in farming, deserve more respect than a confident man standing in a dealer lot is usually inclined to give them, and that the surest way to find out whether you were right is simply to wait long enough for the seasons to tell you. Pete still runs the same operation he always has, modest and careful, making decisions based on what the numbers tell him, rather than what feels good to say out loud in front of an audience. He and Kurt are still neighbors, still friendly, and the old comment from that Saturday morning has become, over the years, less of a wound and more of a story they can both laugh about, in the particular way that farming communities tend to absorb their own history, not by forgetting it, but by turning it, eventually, into something everyone can live with. The lot at Voss Equipment still sees that same kind of moment from time to time. Different farmers, different machines, different jokes that may or may not age well. Most of them are forgotten within a season. A few of them, like this one, end up circulating for years, not because the joke itself was particularly memorable, but because the years that followed it had a way of settling the argument more completely than any conversation in a dealer lot ever could.